Hello, and welcome back to the course. Today's topic is formalism. We are going to discuss the Russian formalists and the Prague linguistic circle and the role that these critics from these groups played in developing the concepts or the theory of formalism. Now, formalism has many key concepts that we are going to review together, especially terms like literariness, defamiliarization, estrangement, intentional and affective fallacy. Now, key names, of course, associated with this theory, that is, with formalism in general, are Viktor Shlovisky, Roman Jakobson, Boris Eschenbaum, and Yuri Tinavov. Now, as you can see from these names, these are mostly Russian names. And in fact, formalism is a lot of the times referred to as Russian formalism, and its critics are the Russian formalists. Now, formalism, without the adjective for Russian, is a general and broader term covering several similar types of literary criticism from many different countries and many different nationalities, from the United States to Russia and Europe, that this movement, formalism, arose in the 1920s and 30s and really flourished during the 1940s and 50s, especially in the United States. And interestingly, the theory is still quite relevant even today. So this is one reason why, of course, we are reviewing it, because it is relevant to many different theories in that we have today, and it is relevant to many different theories in many different ways that we are going to discuss all along the course together, of course. Now, as with many theories, formalism developed as a means of studying, of course, literary texts. It was an early attempt to theorize and draw attention to the way narratives are constructed. As the name suggests, the formalists were oriented towards the form of literature. So this is one term that we should be focusing on, that is the form, the form of literature. According to a leading figure and a leading critic within the formalist theory, Viktor Shlovisky, literature has the ability to make us see the world anew, that is, in a different way. Therefore, he and other formalists advocated the term defamiliarization and estrangement, two terms that we are going to come back to a lot in this particular lesson or lecture today. Now, defamiliarization and estrangement are ways to make that which has become familiar, because we have been overexposed to it, to make it strange again. So something that is overly familiar and normal, make it appear strange. Therefore, the word estrangement. This tendency to make it new was initiated by a group of Russian critics who wanted to develop a formal way to produce an objective method of analyzing and interpreting literature. Now, formalists seek to be objective in their analysis, focusing on the work itself and disregarding external considerations. This idea of rejecting the external considerations or extrinsic considerations will be developed in more details when we discuss, inshallah, new criticism. New criticism is yet another formalist theory, but this one was in the United States. These are American critics. So the idea is that formalists sought to be objective in their analysis. They still do that. That is, they focus on the work itself. They pay particular attention to literary devices used in the work and to the pattern these devices establish. Now, formalism developed largely in reaction to the practice of interpreting literary texts by relating them to external issues such as historical circumstances and politics of the era in which the work was written. Now, formalists have generally suggested that literary language should be different from everyday language, because everyday language serves simply to communicate information and is therefore unimaginative. From the beginning, then, the formalists are focused on what Roman Jacobson considers the literariness of language or of literature, something that makes a literary text different from a newspaper report. You see, what you read in a newspaper is a report. It is journalism. Literature should be different, as simple as that for the Russian formalists. So therefore, the literariness of a text is more important. In other words, although they always worked with individual texts, what they are interested in is what all literary texts have in common, which is the extent to which they have literariness, or the extent to which they are really literary or different from everyday language. The formalists saw the study of literature as a science and concentrated like true scientists on general rules, while the new criticism, which is another form of formalism that we are going to soon discuss, focused on individual meaning of individual texts. Formalism tried to discover general laws. So formalists argued that literariness has the capacity to overturn common and expected pattern. Let us say, for example, grammar or plot of or storyline, and thereby revisiting language so that it becomes innovative language. So the idea, the concept is that the theorists should have the capacity to renegotiate the expected patterns through vocabulary, through grammar, and through plot. So such innovative and fresh uses of language supposedly enable readers to experience not only language but also the word in entirely new ways. A number of schools of literary criticism have, of course, adopted a formalist orientation, or at least make use of formalist concepts. And we are going to see that, obviously, when we are going to discuss and review more contemporary literary criticism theories, of course. Now, the new criticism, which was an American approach to literature that reached its height in the 1940s and 1950s, is a famous type of formalism that we are going to discuss later, that in fact adopted much of what the Russian formalists and the early formalists of the 1920s that belonged to the Prague linguistic circle had advocated and had formulated and had developed. Now, the Russian formalism was the first major formalist movement after the Stalinist regime suppressed it in the early 1930s. The Prague linguistic circle adopted its analytical method. So Russian formalists and Russian formalism paved the way for the Prague linguistic circle. The Chicago School, too, which was based, of course, obviously in the United States, too, has also been classified as formalist insofar as the Chicago critics examine and analyze works often on an individual basis. Their interest in historical material, on the other hand, was clearly not formalists. But you can see here that Russian formalists and the early formalists of Eastern Europe had influenced many literary theories that would come later in the 20th century. Now, Russian formalism refers primarily to the work done in the study of poetic language, founded in 1916 in St. Petersburg. Now, key theorists, as we have already mentioned, are Viktor Shlovisky, Boris Eichenbaum, Yuri Tinanovov, and secondarily to the Moscow Linguistic Circle, founded in 1914 by Roman Jakobson. Now, Russian formalists were interested in the analysis of the text, but their main concern was with method as the scientific basis for literary theory. There was therefore a shift away from the moral approach to literature that was so evident in the 19th century, and also the shift from the moral approach to literature towards some more scientific and objective approach. So these are the two words that you should remember. The two terms are the scientific and the objective study of literature. There are certain basic assumptions of formalist theory. They emphasize on the scientific approach, and they focused on literariness, which can be found on the level of form rather than content, of course. Something that we'll come back to in more details, of course, all along this lecture and in the upcoming lectures, when we will discuss, for example, structuralism, which looks again at this question of the relationship between form and content. So they also saw, the formalists saw art as an act of defamiliarization, and believe that a text is the sum total of its devices, form and content. Now, fabula, that is story, and sujet, that is, these are two concepts developed by the Russian formalists, fabula and suggest. Now, suggest is spelled in Russian Syuzhet, and it's pronounced like we pronounce the word in French, suggest. We must understand that a text has a two-tier mode of existence that Russian formalists are fond of referring to as fabula and suggest. Now, fabula is the raw material of the basic story, and suggest is a transformation of the fabula into a narrative discourse of aesthetic form. Suggest, in other words, is the way a story is organized. So, fabula and suggest. Now, what a work of literature says cannot be separated from how the literary work says it. And therefore, the form gives structure to a work, to a content. Far from being merely the decorative wrapping of the content, form is in fact an integral part of the content of the work. And of course, this is very important way of looking at this relationship between form and content, which we will contrast it and we will see how different it is from how Marxists, for example, and Marxist literary theory looks at this relationship between form and content, and in the sense that in Marxism and in Marxist literary theory, form surpasses and is more important than content, and form content surpasses and is more important than form, and form is only there to serve the content. It's a means to an end. Whereas in Russian formalism and other forms of formalism, content is the means to the end, and the end, of course, is form. Now, Victor Shlovinsky, critical writing, was one of the most prominent work of Russian formalism. One of his most attractive concepts was the idea that we have mentioned before, which is defamiliarization. Now, formalism is concerned with the meaningfulness of artistic devices because it focuses, of course, on the form, as we have said. So the code of the text is not the theme. The code and the core and the most important thing in the text is not the theme, but its devices. The emphasis on the actual process of the presentation of a literary text is known as laying bare its own devices or revealing its devices, according to Shklovsky. Now, the most essential literary thing a novel can achieve is to draw attention, to bring attention to itself and the literary devices it employs, rather than going into something, of course, familiar and usual. And instead of going into the familiar terrain, the idea is to say the same thing or the familiar thing, but in a new way, in an innovative way, in a novel way. How a story is told and draws attention to the literary devices that it employs is what the formalists, of course, would champion and would like to see in literary text, be it a novel or a poem or any other thing, because it is not just about the novel. It was applicable to other genres of literature as well. Now, Roman Jacobson described literature as an organized, quote, an organized violence committed on ordinary speech. Now, this is quite interesting. Organized violence on ordinary speech. Now, this was not your day-to-day language you are looking at, but it is something very organized and planned. And by violence, we mean seeking renegotiation, revisiting. So you see that for them, it is important that they question or they interrogated the everydayness of a text or of literature. Now, literature constitutes a deviation from average speech that intensifies, that invigorates, and estranges the mundane, the normal speech patterns. In other words, for the formalists, literature is set apart because it is just that, set apart. It is not like everyday language. The use of devices such as imagery and rhythm and meter is what separates a poetic utterance from everyday language, from everyday speech. So these are the terms that separate a piece of poem, a work of poem, from ordinary newspaper. These terms are rhythm and meter and the verse. And therefore, these are the devices that should call attention to themselves according to the formalists. Now, coming to the term estrangement now. Coming to the term estrangement, estrangement serves literature by forcing the reader to think about what might have been an ordinary piece of writing about common life experience in a more thoughtful way, to make the familiar unfamiliar by using certain kind of language or certain devices, so to make the familiar strange. In the routines of everyday life, certain perceptions and certain perceptions of and responses to reality become common and blunted, or as the formalists would put it, they become automatized. So therefore, it is the work of literature or literateurs, that is, those who write literary works, to reinvent language and to represent thoughts in an original way. So I would like here to quote Thierry Gilton when he says, by forcing us into a dramatic awareness of language, literature refreshes these habitual responses and renders objects more perceptible. And of course, this quote by Thierry Gilton really sums up what formalism is about. And this was in his, the quote is from his famous essay, What is Literature? Now, coming after the Russian formalism is the Prague Linguistic Circle. Now, the Prague Linguistic Circle is a linguistic movement that began in the 1920s, and they were surpassed by the Russians in the 1930s. They moved to Czechoslovakia and were continued by the members of the Prague Linguistic Circle, which included people like Roman Jakobson and John or Ian Komorowski and René Welek. So these are the members of the Prague Linguistic Circle. Now, the Prague Linguistic Circle viewed literature as a special class of language and rested on the assumption that there is a fundamental opposition between literary or poetical language and ordinary language. That is what we have been talking about all along, of course, that there is an inherent difference between literary language and common everyday language. So there is violence, there is a tension between these two. And these critics, the formalists, were interested in understanding those tensions. So tension is the integral unity of the work and often involves irony and paradox. This is something we will look at into greater details at a later stage when we will talk about new criticism in the here in the online course or in these videos or in the face-to-face classes. Now, other interesting terms are intentional fallacy and affective fallacy, two terms that formalist critics refer to a lot. Now, first, the first one, that is the belief that the meaning of a work may be determined by the author's intention, is what is called intentional fallacy. Now, the affective fallacy in the new criticism is the belief that the meaning or value of a work may be determined by its effect on the reader, by its feeling, by what the reader would feel. Now, another interesting term is objective correlative. It was first introduced by or coined by T.S. Eliot. And this term refers to a collection of object situations or events that immediately evoke specific emotions. So therefore, objective correlative. There is another term which we should be familiar with, which is external form, which is the outer trappings of a work. Now, for example, in a poem, the external form would include the rhyme scheme, the meter, and the stanza form, whether it is a blank verse or a sonnet or a ballad. Now, so those are the external trappings of a work. Now, Victor Slokvisky, in his book Art as Technique, which was published in 1917, suggested that there are two distinct distinct ways of communicating information to an audience. Now, poetic forms appeal to the reader's emotions by using metaphorical devices to reveal something in a new light. Alternatively, information can be given in a matter-of-fact way that is grounded in straightforward ideas and can be perceived as factual. Now, Shklovsky argued that poetic forms see ordinary things in a different way to make the familiar strange, or what he called ostragyny. Now, so this is one word that you should know, ostragyny. Now, ostragyny is spelled Ostragynie, ostragyny. So, to make familiar strange, the way to make familiarity strange was to make ideas and objects appear unusual or new to the reader. And Shklovsky referred to this as the process of defamiliarization. The idea of defamiliarization works well in the case of poetry, especially in the difficult and experimental modernist poetry. While talking about estrangement and ostragyny, we should also remember another concept by another writer who was not exactly formalist. Now, the idea is alienation, to make alien. Now, alienation was given by the German playwright Bertolt Brecht. Now, Brecht did something similar to the word of stage to drama as these writers did to poetry or to the novel. So the idea of alienation is how to alienate the audience from what is happening on the stage. So first of all, earlier, the Greek theater believed in giving us the concept of catharsis, to make the audience one with the happening on the stage, to make the audience emotionally relate or to get them involved emotionally to what is happening on the stage, so that what is happening on the stage and the audience become one, and the audience would achieve this moment, this crucial moment called catharsis, in which everything is expressed emotionally. So they would get involved with the lives and with the plot, with the happening in the story. Now, this is something that Bertolt Brecht did and wanted to break from, and he introduced the concept of alienation, and he did this by using various theatrical devices. So again, we are talking about the literariness of devices, of course, where he focused on creating a sort of estrangement between the characters on the stage and the audience. So instead of coming together into that moment, that crucial and critical moment of catharsis, he wanted them to be as separated from each other as possible by alienating the audience from what is happening on the stage. Now, in doing so, he was forcing the audience to think rather than get emotionally involved with the happenings on the stage. So this was a result of the Russian formalism, though strictly speaking, we do not call Bertolt Brecht a formalist. That's about it in terms of formalism for today. I would like to thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next video, inshallah. Thank you very much.